All right, thank you very much. And good evening, everybody. Normally at something like this, I'd be thanking you for coming out this evening on such a bad evening, but I'm now going to actually thank you for staying in, which is a bit strange because these are strange times. But look, it's a real pleasure. And Cara, thank you so much for the invite. This is a bit like a busman's holiday for me, being asked to talk about Brendan Kennelly, someone I've admired and worked with and written about for the past 40 years is an absolute privilege. So you're all very welcome. Obviously tonight, folks, I'm going to be fairly selective because you're talking about a long career. You're talking about a man who has over 40 books of poetry, 6 plays, an enormous amount of personal criticism, literary criticism, anthologies, 5 or 6 anthologies of prose and poetry. So a prolific writer. So I'm going to obviously have to be selective in terms of what I'm going to talk about tonight. But I do want to, now I'm just going to move this order. I just want to start off with a little personal anecdote. The first time I met Brendan, I was actually on a date with a very lucky woman. We've been married now for 32 years or 31 years. So that's how lucky she is. But we were on a date in O'Neill's pub on the corner of Suffolk Street in Dublin. And this used to be, in the old days, Brendan's haunt. And I remember I was a first year student in college, thought I knew it all. And I was sitting there, I was late for the date actually. And when I arrived in the pub, my date was sitting there talking to this man in a belted Mac. For those of you who know Brendan, you know that grey Mac and the scarf. These were the signature clothes of Brendan. And she was sitting down talking to this guy. So I went over, full of the bravado of a first year in UCD, thinking I knew everything. And I sat down, and I started quoting Hamlet and Shakespeare and Wordsworth to try and impress not only my future girlfriend, but to try and get rid of this fella so I could actually have a proper date. And of course, he started out quoting me fairly seriously and very quickly. And I went up to the bar to get a drink, and I said to the barman, "Who in the name of God is that fella sitting down there in the corner talking to my date?" He said, "That's Professor Kennelly." So suitably chastened, I went back. The date went very well. We're now married 31 years, 5 kids later. Brendan knows Trish very well. She says hello, Brendan, if you're listening. I then went out to Waterstones and bought Brendan's collection, The Boats Are Home, which was the collection out. This was in around 1982. This would have been the collection that was out at that stage. And from there on in, it was just an intellectual love affair, let's put it that way, with Brendan's work. And I genuinely believe he is one of the most underrated and important poets that Ireland has produced in the last 40 to 50 years. And hopefully, over the course of the talk now, we might redress that balance somewhat. And when you're talking about the life of a poet, it's very difficult, especially with such a long and successful career that Brendan has had, to try and pinpoint key moments. But for me, when I was in college, I read a book called Mythology or Mythology by the French critic Roland Barthes. And for those of you who've read the book, it was published in 1957. This was a real eye-opener for me, because what Barthes did in his book was he critiqued French culture. And he analyzed culture in a way, almost for the first time. This was a unique analysis of culture, a semiotic analysis of all the signs of identity, the signs of culture. And he looked at 3 major features of French culture and French life. One was the Citroën DS. You see that lovely car in the middle. For those of you of an older vintage, you might remember The Day of the Jackal, the film about the assassination of de Gaulle, or attempted assassination. That car featured heavily. Of course, red wine is so associated with French culture. And he also talked about wrestling. What Barthes did was he demythologized so many of the myths we create about national and personal identity. And for me, this is exactly what Brendan has been engaged with throughout his poetic career. And I think this is Brendan's greatest achievement. I think a lot of people see Brendan as the poet of the local, as a poet celebrating Ballylongford and North Kerry. And of course, that North Kerry heritage is central to Brendan's work. But I would regard Brendan as the great demythologizer. Now, there's a word, if you have false teeth, be very careful. Demythologizer is a great word. This is what Brendan is for me. And he has demythologized so many aspects of Irish life. And I think this is his great contribution to contemporary Irish poetry. Because if you look at the development of modern Ireland, if you look at all the changes that have occurred in this country in the last 15, 20 years even, you know, we are a much more liberal country. We have ditched, or at least moved away from, some of the great markers of Irish identity. And I would regard Brendan as a key thinker in this whole process of demythologization. So what Brendan has actually done, in my opinion, he voices the other, the outsider, the excluded, the marginalized. This is what Brendan has done over the course of his poetic career. And I'm going to say a lot more as the evening progresses about individual characters that Brendan has chosen. And the reason I think Brendan is the great demythologizer is that he robs ideology of its most powerful weapon, and that is silence. People who cannot write back. Brendan has, throughout his poetic career, I would argue, tried to voice those who are voiceless. I produced a book in 2008 called A Fine Statement, and Brendan chose 5 poems for it. I'm going to say a little bit more about that. And the poems he chose were really poems that voice the outsider. And Brendan, in some ways, you can argue, has been an outsider himself. You know, he was one of the first Catholics to enter Trinity College back in the 1950s. He has been an outsider, and he is a Kerry man, very much a Kerry man, but who has adopted Dublin as his home. And I remember Brendan once telling me a great little anecdote. There's a picture of Trinity College in the background there, because Brendan and Trinity are synonymous. I remember visiting Brendan in Trinity on a number of occasions, and a very generous host he was. But Brendan had a great quote when I think the first ever Catholic provost was appointed at Trinity College. And I asked Brendan, you know, because he was one of the first Catholics to enter Trinity College, I said, did he regard it as a major event? And he said, oh, John, he said, it's less the winds of change, more a change of wind, which I thought was a kind of a classic Brendan comment. So really what Brendan, I think, in his poetry does, I talk about the power of language is key to understanding poetry, because, you know, we are linguistic creatures. We are people who communicate through language. Language defines us. In many ways, language is our identity and a key part of our identity. And Brendan is very much a poet who has played with language, who enjoys language, who relishes language. And for those of you who've read his poetry, you know that Brendan is a superb linguist. And of course, Brendan, in his own academic career, got a first-class honours degree in French from Trinity College, is a fluent Irish speaker. So Brendan himself is a very talented linguist. But I think what Brendan has done over the course of his career as well is to try and help reshape Irish identity. I know it's a big claim, but it's a claim, I think, that can stand up to scrutiny. And I like this picture here on the bottom left of Brendan and Seamus Heaney at a meeting. And I've taken a quote here from an essay by Seamus Heaney in his prose collection, Preoccupations. And this is what Heaney argued poets in Ireland should be doing. This would have been around the late 60s, early 70s. And this is Heaney. I began by suggesting that my point of view involved poetry as divination, as a restoration of the culture to itself. In Ireland in this century, it has involved for Yeats and many others an attempt to define and interpret the present by bringing it into significant relationship with the past. And I believe that effort in our present circumstances has to be urgently renewed. And I think this is a key idea from Heaney, which an awful lot of poets, I think, tapped into in the 1960s and 1970s, Brendan being amongst them. Also, I'd put in another poet. I've done some work on Paul Durcan. I think Paul Durcan was very much looking at a relationship. This is precisely, I think, Brendan's greatest poetic achievement. Now, again, I'm being selective because I think Brendan has achieved so much over his poetic career and has so many different interests and different strands to his work. I'm going to be looking over the next, 10 or 15 minutes, principally at this attempt to bring the past into significant relationship with the present. I'd also like, folks, if you don't mind, to briefly draw your attention to this wonderful book called Journey into Joy, edited by the excellent Kennelly scholar Ocha Persson. And Ocha did an awful lot of work with Brendan and on Brendan in the 90s and did some excellent work with Blood Axe as well. Blood Axe Books, who are Brendan's publishers. But I'd strongly recommend that you read Brendan's prose, because he is known as a poet. Now, he has produced 2 novels. He's written 2 novels and 5 or 6 plays. But his criticism, his literary criticism, is absolutely excellent. I'm currently doing some work on a book on Patrick Kavanagh. And I know Patrick Kavanagh was a huge influence on Brendan. And Brendan has written wonderfully. I can't think of a critic who has written more interesting and more insightful work on Patrick Kavanagh than Brendan Kennelly. So he's a bit of a polyglot, is our Brendan. He's talented at quite a few things. And really, Brendan's not that a reputation of a poet relies on certain texts, but these are the two major texts that Brendan relies upon. And when you look at the Parabola of Brendan's work, these two would certainly be, I think, at the apex of that parabola. And we're looking at Cromwell from 1983 and the Book of Judas from 1991. And the version I have here, the picture I have here, I actually have my own first edition of Cromwell, the Beaver Row Press version. But these are two key collections from Brendan in which Brendan really gets to grip with Irish identity. And he gets to grip with Irish identity in a strange way, using very clever techniques. And it's almost approaching the subject from the side. Percy Shelley once said that we distrust literature that has a design upon us. And I think you could never accuse Brendan of a literature that has a design upon us, because Brendan's approach is so clever and so nuanced that his critique of identity becomes very, very strong. So these are two of Brendan's major collections. Now, they are long poems, and it's like Cromwell is over 240, 250 poems, sonnets, all of them. The Book of Judas, again, I have the Book of Judas here. The Book of Judas, again, is 400 or 500 poems. An extraordinary analysis of the life of Judas Iscariot, as Cromwell is an extraordinary analysis of the life of Oliver Cromwell. And this is the poem that I want to begin with. This is one of the poems from Cromwell called Therefore I Smile. And what Brendan does in a lot of his poetry is, one of his early collections back in 1990 was called A Time for Voices. I think it was Blood Axe Books' first edited collection of Brendan's work. And A Time for Voices, I think, does what it says on the tin. Brendan is a poet who voices others, and he voices people very often who do not have a voice themselves. Now, Oliver Cromwell was certainly no subaltern figure, a very powerful man, established the Parliament in Britain. And I can remember as a kid going to visit my Aunt Eileen over in London, and wandering into London as a kid and seeing a statue of Oliver Cromwell outside the Houses of Parliament. And I couldn't imagine how the beast, as one of my teachers used to call him, would have a statue outside the Houses of Parliament. But what Brendan does is Brendan gives him a voice. And this is the poem. And I'll just draw your attention to Buff. This is from Cromwell from 1983. And in it, there's a character called MPGM Buffoon, the central character. And Buffoon is haunted by nightmares of Percy Shelley, of Edmund Spenser, and of Oliver Cromwell. And the poems are a whole series of engagements between Buffoon in the present and Cromwell butting into the present and trying to explain to Buffoon who he was and what he did. And this is what he says in Therefore I Smile. Under it all, Oliver said, the problem was simple. How could I make the Irish work? The Irish hate work, not knowing what it means. I do. Work exists. It is inevitable and stark, a dull, fierce necessity. Later ages may consider it superfluous, but my glimpses of this world were true. I looked, I saw, I considered, I did what was necessary. To live is to work, to be is to do. Put a man in a field, a soldier fighting a wall, a wife in bed, a whore in a street, a king on a throne. Someone must dig a grave for the dead, and the dead must rot. Even dead flesh works in the earth, but not the Irish buff, not you, nor your countrymen. They will prattle, argue, drink, yarn, but not work. Someone had to teach them not to idle their lives away. I taught them to do things my way. Against their will, I gave them a style. I tendered them the terrible gift of my name, knowing they would make songs about me, echoing curses soaked in verbal bile, twisted poems and stories to make an excuse for what they would fail to do, to be, being themselves. I am Oliver Cromwell still. Therefore, I smile. And this is one of many of I think, these wonderful poems where Cromwell gets a voice, because very often in history, when we think of characters who are portrayed to us in history books, in documentaries, their life story is told to us by somebody else. We never knew them personally. We had no way of getting to know who these people were. And Brendan did research on Oliver Cromwell. And Cromwell emerged as quite an interesting character in his own right, wrote some beautiful letters to his daughters from Ireland. Now, his reputation in Ireland, of course, was of a fierce soldier. But Brendan also told me when I was talking to him about Cromwell that nothing he did in Ireland was outside of the so that when Cromwell was sieging towns in Ireland, he did offer them a chance to resign if they wished. And this is the Oliver Cromwell who emerges as a much more complex character in Brendan's work. And to say that history does indeed matter now, I hope this picture, Bertie Ahern, doesn't frighten you too much. This is a story from the Guardian newspaper in 2006, and I think it's a fascinating story to show you just how relevant someone like Oliver Cromwell is. Now, I must say, I think Cromwell is more my father's generation and perhaps my generation. My kids now at this stage would struggle to mention or would struggle to know who Oliver Cromwell was. But this is a wonderful little vignette from the Guardian in 2006. It says, a story in the British Independent newspaper in July 2004 concerned a portrait of Oliver Cromwell in a British government office. Stephen Fry, at the recent launch of the History Matters campaign, recounted an incident when the Irish Prime Minister Bertie Ahern paid his first visit to the late Robin Cook's office, where a portrait of Cromwell hung from the wall. The Taoiseach walked in and walked straight out again, said Fry. He said, I'm not coming in until you've taken down that picture of that murdering bastard. It was a bit like hanging up a portrait of Eichmann before a visit of the Israeli Prime Minister. That shows that history does indeed matter. And what I think Brendan has done with Cromwell, and this is what makes the poem such an important and significant long poem in the development, not only of an Irish literary identity, but an Irish social and cultural identity, is humanized Cromwell, has taken the silence from the past, has given Cromwell a voice. Now, Cromwell, as I said, was not a subaltern figure. He was a very powerful man. But the way he has been portrayed in Irish history as this, this savage creature, the butcher of Drogheda, what Brendan does, and it is controversial to do that. Not everybody will thank you for doing it. People will say, well, you shouldn't do it. These people don't deserve a voice. These were butchers. But what Brendan does is shows that history is complicated and that history is something that needs to be interrogated. And we need to interrogate our own ghosts. We need to bring our own ghosts into in a dialogue with the present. And Brendan always talks in his poetry about connection. That poetry is about making connections. And he's making connections between Oliver Cromwell and the present and the past. And of course, Cromwell was, a very interesting figure. He was very interested in the work of Isaac Newton, for example, the founder of astrophysics, or one of the more important figures in the development of astrophysics and in the development of modern science. So Cromwell is a very complex character, and this is what I think Brendan brings about. But it's interesting that quote would appear from the Guardian newspaper in 2006. So how does Brendan do this? What's the process of it? Now, I think what Brendan really uses is what I would call the dream imagination. Well, it's what Sigmund Freud would call the dream imagination. And the dream imagination is this wonderful thing. Now, you'll all be dreaming tonight, and you never know, I might be in your dream. God help you if I am. But we all dream, and you'll be dreaming tonight about all sorts of different things. And your dreams will be plastic, they'll be pliant, they will be strange, they will be odd. And Sigmund Freud wrote that the dream imagination, we have two imaginations. We have our conscious imagination, where we're deliberately trying to create and recreate the world around us. But then when we dream, we have a preference for what is immoderate, exaggerated, and monstrous. But at the same time, being freed from the hindrances of the categories of thought, it gains in pliancy, agility, and versatility. And for me, this is precisely how Brendan's poetry works. He is immoderate, exaggerated, and monstrous. Cromwell emerges from Brendan's work as an utter psychopath, as a bloodthirsty drug addict, but also as a sensitive father, as a man who came to Ireland, as he said, to do some terrible surgery, as if he was doing this country some good by trying to bring Ireland into the so-called modern age as he would have seen it. But this is Brendan, and I think pliancy, agility, and versatility, these are three words that would most certainly apply to a good deal of Brendan's work. And the next collection I really want to look at in terms of this dream imagination is the Book of Judas, which was published in 1991. And the Book of Judas, as I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, was Brendan's analysis of Judas Iscariot. And I think I remember seeing Brendan being interviewed on the Late Late Show after the publication of Cromwell. And he said he was very interested in doing a similar analysis of Christianity in Ireland and the role of Christianity in Ireland. So he takes Judas and the character of Judas Iscariot, and Judas emerges as, again, this complex, confused human, as Oliver Cromwell is a complex, confused human. And this is one of my favorite poems from the Book of Judas. And remember, the Book of Judas is a very long collection in which I think Brendan explores the whole concept of betrayal and loyalty and concepts of identity. And here's the poem called The Dinner. James Joyce had dinner with the Holy Family one Saturday evening in Nazareth. Mary was a good cook. Her virgin soup was delicious. Joyce lapped it till he was nearly out of breath. The Holy Family looked at Joyce, who said nothing. He was a morose, broody class of a man. His glasses made him look very sad. It was next to impossible to get him to talk, and the dinner was uncomfortable as a result. How are things in Ireland? Asked Joseph. Oh, said Joyce. What are you writing now? Persisted Joseph. I couldn't find a fault with your last book. Perfect. Joyce seemed to sulk. A large work, he muttered, like the Bible, the sea, my voices. Am I in it? Queried Jesus. Yep, said Joyce. Pass the salt. Is it too much to inquire about the role I play? Continued Jesus. It is, said Joyce. Mary changed the subject. Are there many grottos to me in Ireland? Countless, replied our hero. Joyce's short answers were buggering the dinner up. The Society of Jesus, queried Jesus. How's it going? Who knows Clongowes, said Joyce. Could I have a cup of Bewley's coffee to round off the occasion? Why did you leave Ireland, James? Queried Joseph. The Swiss, French, Italians are just as lousy in their ways. Joyce pondered. Crime, he replied, of non-being. Jesus butted in. In that case, you must have sinners in plenty. I think I should visit Ireland sometime. I wouldn't if I were you, said Joyce. But you're not me, said Jesus, though there are times when you behave as if you were the Son of Man himself. You get in my hair, James, from time to time, with your pretentious posturing, sitting on a cloud, paring your toenails in an orgy of indifference, pissed on white wine, though I readily admit your prose is divine, with touches of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Why can't you be an honest-to-God Dubliner? Go for a swim in Sandymount, spend Sunday afternoon in Croke Park or D'Alir, boast of things you've never done, places you've never been, have a pint in O'Neill's, misjudge the political scene, complain about the weather, miss mass, go to knock, take a week in Killarney, listen to McCormick's records, relearn to mock, jibe, scandalise, sneer, scoff, and talk your head off. James, you have a block about Ireland. You're too long on the continent. In some strange way, James, you are, if you ask me, bent. But I didn't ask you, Jesus, replied Joyce. It so happens I think things out for myself. I had to leave Ireland to do this, because no one in Ireland has a mind of his own. I know that plays to the marrow of its bone, and I insist that people are dominated by your henchmen, those chaps in black who tell folk what to think. I beg your pardon, said Jesus. These men are not me. Would you put that in ink? Asked Joyce. In blood, Jesus replied. This is getting too serious, Joseph interrupted. Shut up, Dad, said Jesus. The matter is serious. It's precisely for this kind of crap I came and died. But you're alive and well, son, Joseph said. You're not dead, and we're the Holy Family. That's what they call us. What family is holy, holy? Asked Jesus. Joseph looked around him and then at the ground, perplexed. That honest carpenter didn't seem comfortable. There was nothing he couldn't do with timber, but this was a different matter. He said nothing, just poured himself another cup of Bewley's coffee. Mary said, let's finish with a song, Mr. Joyce. I understand that you took second place to Mr. McCormick at a fesh, but that's a long time ago. Though second place is not the place for you. Perhaps you'd give the Holy Family a song. Joyce brooded a bit, took a deep breath, straightened his glasses gone slightly askew, coughed once, then sang The Rose of Nazareth. The Holy Family loved his voice. It was pure and clear and strong, the perfect voice of the perfect sinner and the perfect end to the dinner. Now, I know it's a long poem, but I think, again, this is a classic comedic narrative poem by Brendan Kennelly. And I love the poem because it contains so much knowledge as well, his knowledge of Joyce, his rereading of Irish identity. And again, this notion of Irish identity that's contained on the page here on my left, when he talks about characteristics of the Irish in terms of their hypocrisy and in terms of their self-inflated self-perception. And this is one thing that Brendan has consistently attempted to do in his poetry, I think, is to burst the bubble of complacency. It's something Joyce did, this crime of non-being. I think that is something you could never accuse Brendan Kennelly of, is the crime of non-being. And his poetry is a consistent attempt in a kind of a Joycean way to rewrite and to reinterpret Irish history. Now, this poem is for my dad. My dad, it's a bit cheeky of me to dedicate one of Brendan's poems, but my dad is 91 and he's getting the vaccine tomorrow. So good luck to you, Dad. My dad was never a fan of Eamon de Valera, and I think you're either in one camp or the other in Ireland in terms of de Valera. You either worshipped him or you hated him. There's very few in the middle. And this is Brendan's poem called Points of View. And I think this again is a classic Kennellian perspective on a figure from the past. A neighbour said de Valera was as straight as Christ, as spiritually strong. The man in the next house said 'twas a great pity he wasn't crucified as young. And my father always loved this poem, and every time I read it to him, he always nodded in agreement. So I think you know what side he was on in that particular debate. But Brendan's first publication was in 1959. His first 4 publications were with wonderfully underrated poet Rudy Holzapfel, who I had the pleasure of meeting. I think he ran a bookshop, was it in Cashel in County Tipperary, and a wonderful poet in his own right. And Brendan and Rudy published Cast a Cold Eye together. And I think it was interesting that Brendan kind of found his poetic feet with Rudy. And Rudy passed away a number of years ago, but a wonderful poet. So if you're ever looking for a kind of a poet with very little critical work on him, Rudy is certainly a person to look at, but 2 wonderful poets. But I can't really escape the 1950s, folks, without this, because I remember speaking to Brendan at length about this. If you have a look at that picture there now, this is a little spot the Kennelly. Brendan is in that picture. That's the All-Ireland minor, Kerry minor team of 1954. Now, this has the score, folks, I hate to say it. I know most of you from Kerry, it has a familiar ring, doesn't it? Dublin 3-3, Kerry 1-8, a heartbreaking 1-point loss again. Hopefully, in the near future, that'll be revised. But Brendan was quite a good footballer in his day, and he played in the minor All-Ireland final. And I remember talking to Brendan when I was interviewing him many years ago. And I said, Brendan, are you cherished in Kerry? He said, no, I'm not. He said, what I'm remembered for is this. And it says the 1954 All-Ireland minor final versus Dublin. Kerry were 2 points up when Kennelly conceded a free, from which Dublin's Vinnie Bell contrived a winning goal. And by the poet's sad telling, Vinnie Bell has told for him ever since, most recently last year, when a renowned old acquaintance dismissed the glories of 6 decades with a query, are you the little fella that lashed the All-Ireland for us in 54? And Brendan still to this day, I don't know, would he swap all the poetic accolades for that minor medal? Maybe we could ask him someday. I actually think, I was looking at the picture earlier on, I think that might be Mick O'Dwyer actually, at the front right-hand corner. If we were live in Listowel, I guarantee you my audience would know probably every person in that picture. But this shows you the many sides to Brendan, you know, that this notion of Brendan being simply this ivory-towered academic is very far from the truth. And in 2008, I published an anthology of poetry. You'll see it there, my shameless self-promotion on the bottom left-hand corner, called A Fine Statement. And in it, I asked 20 poets to choose 5 of their own poems, what they would regard as their most important work, or the poems they would like to be known for. And I wrote to Brendan, and I wrote to John Montague. And just to carry the little football theme a little further, in his letter back to me, John Montague said, of course I would be glad to play on the Poolbeg Gaelic rules team. I will not inquire as to who the other players are. I will put Kennelly in goal, however, and Hartnett at full forward. Very nippy. So I hate to say, Brendan, you were relegated to goalkeeper. Maybe after the giving away the free in 1954, the refuge of the scoundrel is always between the posts. But I need to say a little bit more about that book, because the Fine Statement is where I asked 20 poets to each choose their own 5 poems that they would like to have in an anthology. And when you look at anthologies, they're usually put together by, you know, maybe academics or other poets or people with an interest in poetry. But I asked Brendan to pick his own 5 poems. And for those of you who know his work, these were the 5 that Brendan chose. And I think it's really interesting that, you know, he had complete choice, complete freedom, and these were the 5 he chose. And for me, it says an awful lot about Brendan's approach to his own work. We have God's Eye, Eily Kilbride, Poem from a 3-year-old, Yes, and Begin. And for those of you who are familiar with these poems, many of you will be familiar with Begin. Begin, I suppose, has become Brendan's anthem. You know, if Seamus Heaney is known for Digging or Midterm Break, Brendan, if you asked the general public to pick a poem, one poem by Brendan Kennelly, Begin is more than likely the poem that they would choose. But I think the 5 are very interesting. God's Eye refers to Brendan's love of nature and birds. It features crows and sparrows, and you know, we see it in the weather today, the beginning of spring. Well, the tentative beginning of spring. And Brendan had a passionate interest in nature and has written about it regularly. Eily Kilbride features this girl in Cork, and I think she's homeless, and or from a very poor, broken, fractured background. And Brendan, she is the classic person for Brendan to voice, because Brendan always had a natural empathy for those less fortunate than himself, a real humanist in the full sense of the word. Poem from a 3-year-old is a wonderful poem. Now this, of course, if anyone younger is listening to this, you would have seen this on the Leaving Cert syllabus. Brendan has a real joy in him. I always found Brendan fantastic company and great fun. His poetry is serious, and his poetry can be dark, and it can be violent, and it can, delve into the deepest recesses of humanity. But there's such a humanity in Brendan, and such a fantastic sense of humor, and a really daring sense of humor. But Brendan is fundamentally an educator, and this is a wonderful poem about asking questions. It's just a whole series of questions. And one of the regular techniques utilized by Brendan in his work is the process of asking questions. Many of his poems, I think, when the typesetters are setting up Brendan Kennelly's poetry, the question mark is a very regularly used item for Brendan. He's always asking questions of us, the reader, and of national identity, personal identity, querying everything, accepting nothing at face value. But then, of course, the poem Yes. I think this is Brendan's fundamental optimism. You know, when you read Brendan's work, he's very much prepared to go to the dark recesses of the soul, but he's fundamentally a shining light. I think he's such an optimistic person, such a force of nature, a driving force. And this, of course, comes across in the poem Yes. And isn't yes a great word? You know, we love the word yes. Too many people begin sentences with no. But yes is a word that Brendan continually uses. And Begin, of course, is this poem that has become, in a sense, Brendan's anthem. And this is the poem Yes, which I just wanted to read briefly with you from The Boats Are Home. This is one of Brendan's own selections from his poetry that he would like people to remember him for. I love the word, and hear its long struggle with no, even in the bird's throat and the budging crocus. Some winter's night I see it flood the faces of my friends, ripen their laughter, and plant early flowers in their conversation. You will understand when I say it is for me a morning word, though it is older than the sea and hisses in a way that may have given an example to the serpent itself. It is this ageless incipience whose influence is found in the first and last pages of books, in the grim skin of the affirmative battler, and in the voices of women that constitutes the morning quality of yes. We have all thought what it must be like never to grow old. The dreams of our elders have mythic endurance, though their hearts are stilled, but the only agelessness is yes. I am always beginning to appreciate the agony from which it is born. Clues from here and there suggest such agony is hard to bear, but is the shaping God of the world that we sometimes hear and struggle to be. And again, I think this is such an affirming poem and a poem of tremendous affirmation. Now, for those of you familiar with Brendan's work, you can realize that my job tonight is virtually impossible. And I'm probably making it seem impossible as well, that Brendan has had over 40 collections of poems. I just have a brief little selection of them here. I'm going to finish tonight later on with a poem from Maloney Up and At It, one of my favorite collections, and actually one of Brendan's favorite collections as well, because Brendan said a very interesting thing about poetry. He said, you know, comedy is very difficult to do. that poetry tends to lend itself towards the darker side of humanity. And when we read poetry, and for those who do read a lot of poetry, it does tend to deal with death, with broken hearts, with, the more difficult aspects of life. And it's rare to come across poetry that is purely based on fun. And Maloney Up and At It is one of those. But some of these are very, very significant collections. Shelley in Dublin from 1974 traces the visit of Percy Shelley to Dublin. A Dream of a Black Fox. In a way, you can kind of see the Ted Hughes influence here when Hughes talks about the thought fox, that Kennelly's very much interested in these poems about nature and the role of nature. Then, of course, you have Poetry My Arse. Now, I can remember Brendan telling me this story. I hope it's true. And if Alan is listening, he features in it, that Brendan told me once that a lot of tourists would wander into Kennelly's pub, as I did, and got an excellent pint and a toasted cheese sandwich. And Alan was behind the bar, and I said, Brendan said to me that so many people come up to him and say, "Oh, you're Brendan Kennelly's brother. Are you a poet as well?" And apparently, Alan's instinctive response was, "Poetry my arse," was the response that he handed out to the budding Kennelly tourists. Whether that's true or not, and in some ways it doesn't matter. I think it's a good story, whether it's true or not. I'd also point out, folks, a very superb book on the bottom left, Dark Fathers into Light. This is the first sort of critical anthology on Brendan's work. Now, I was fortunate enough to do the first book-length sequence on Brendan called A Host of Ghosts. This book here, A Host of Ghosts, which I published in 2004. But this is a wonderful series of critical essays on Brendan's work, if you're interested in following it through, or if in reading a little bit more about Brendan. And then, of course, The Man Made of Rain, an extraordinary collection of poems after Brendan had quadruple bypass surgery. And I think probably hallucinating under the effects of the painkillers he was on. He was visited by this Man Made of Rain, and it's an extraordinary collection of poems in which Brendan has the visions of the past, and his childhood in Ballylongford comes flooding back to him. And it's all complicated and mixed up with the present, with the future, with these ghosts who appear. And, Brendan is very much of his locality. He's written wonderful poems on Ballylongford and on North Kerry in general. But Brendan also left Kerry as a relatively young man and spent most of his life in Dublin. So Dublin features very strongly also in Brendan's work. So he has both the city and the rural to play with. And these are just a brief selection, and the most recent collection in 2013. But I know that a new collection from Brendan is in the pipeline. Now, for those of you who really want to look at his work, this is the book I would recommend you have a look at. It's called Familiar Strangers. New and selected poems. Now, it only goes up to 2004, but Jerry Smith, the literary critic, has this wonderful analysis, this wonderful little comment on the book, and I think it's worth reading. This was his review of Kennelly's work in Familiar Strangers. He said, "From the outset, he was a poet with a mission. His affinity with Kavanagh is obvious. He is the poet of proper praise, but he also knows when to unleash the scathing utterance, the Swiftian lash, against whatever, pomp, sanctimony, falsehood, the self-regarding ego, the vulnerability of society's victims. There is no posturing. His attacks are full-blooded. As Gerald Daw has pointed out, he assailed the myth of Ireland with a vengeance. There are certain Kennelly poems that surely afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted." I think that's a great line. To afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. And I think what Jerry has pointed out is something that I absolutely know Brendan has been doing for decades, is assailing the myth of Ireland with a vengeance. And we are better for it. One of the phrases that is continually used about Brendan is this notion of betraying the age. And this is what Brendan has done in his poetry. And he did this with Judas, is that Judas was not an evil person. Judas's betrayal of Jesus was a necessary part of Jesus's messianic vision of himself. So those who betray a society are the ones who question it, the ones who are not prepared to sit back and accept pomp, sanctimony, falsehood, or self-regarding egos. And I think that's a wonderful analysis of the work by Jerry Smith. And another person who needs, I think, a very honourable mention in Brendan's career is the extraordinary Neil Astley, the editor of Blood Axe Books. And Brendan the relationship between a poet and their publisher is a very important one. When you think of, say, the Gallery Press and Peter Fallon, you think of Liam Miller and the Dolman Press. When you think of the relationship between publishers are the unseen heroes very often of poetic careers. And Brendan has been very fortunate to have Neil Astley as his publisher. And Bloodaxe have produced some wonderful collections of Brendan's work over the years. And Neil is an extraordinary editor. And the books are beautifully produced, very cleverly edited. And Neil has a knowledge of Kennelly's work, which I think is second to none. And he deserves tremendous credit for all the work I think he has put in over the years on Brendan's work. And the publications are so wonderful. Bloodaxe in general, not just on Kennelly's work. They're one of the finest poetry publishing houses, not only in Britain, but in the world. And I think it's a great outlet for Brendan to reach a much broader audience for his work. So he's very lucky to have met Neil, and they're a good combination and a good fit. And the first collection I bought was The Boats Are Home. And I've given plenty of talks on Brendan over the years. And I gave a talk in Limerick, in the library in Limerick a number of years ago. And I read out this poem. And a man came up to me afterwards and he was crying. And he told me that this was a poem that absolutely reminded him of his childhood and his education in Ireland. And this man, I suppose, was in his 70s. But Brendan's love of the sonnet is something that's very important. The sonnet, in my opinion, is arguably the finest form of poetry. 14 lines. So it's relatively short. It is concise. It presents you with an idea. It explores that idea. And then in the last 2 lines, you have the idea wrapped up. It's a very pseudo-logical poetic construction. And Brendan, I think, has had a lifetime love affair with the sonnet. And some of his finest poems have been sonnets. But I also need to say now at this stage that Brendan is as comfortable with the epigram as he is with the sonnet, as he is with the villanelle, as he is with the haiku, or even the long poem. Like, Brendan's attention to form is extraordinary. His own PhD was on the Irish epic. And I think it shouldn't surprise anybody that from a very early age, even in his own academic career, that he was interested in the epic form. And his collections, to me, always make sense. When Brendan has a book like The Boats Are Home, each poem stands alone, but they're all connected. It's like reading a poetic novel. And I think Brendan's very clever in terms of the construction of his books. They are not standalone poems. They're all linked in together. And this is a poem called Catechism. Religion class. Mulcahy taught us God while he heated his arse to a winter fire, testing with his fingers the supple sally rod. Explain the Immaculate Conception, Maguire, and tell us then about the mystical blood. Maguire failed. Mulcahy covered the boy's head with his satchel, shoved him stumbling among the desks, lashed his bare legs until they bled. Who goes to hell, Deneen? Cain, what's a saint? Doolan, what constitutes a mortal sin? Flynn, what of the man who calls his brother a fool? Years killed raving questions. Cain stomped around Dublin in policemen's boots. Flynn was afraid of himself. Maguire did well out of whores in Liverpool. And the sister poem to this in the collection, The Boats Are Home, is called After School. Now, if I was standing in front of you, I'm sure I could get a corroboration of this. I believe that is Ballylongford National School, the old school, before it was replaced. I looked at the Kennelly archive and I got this picture of it. I believe as well that would have been the primary school that Brendan attended. And Brendan has spent his life as an educator, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that because I think, we know Brendan as a poet and as a novelist and as a playwright, but many people know Brendan as a teacher, as a lecturer, and as a wonderful speaker. I remember having the privilege of introducing Brendan at the Driocht Theatre in Blanchardstown a number of years ago, where he gave a reading, and of course it was packed. And I stood behind Brendan because I introduced him, and then I stood behind him. And he had all of his notes and his books beside him, walked up to the microphone, put them down, and then proceeded to recall poems by Yeats, by the Romantic poets, by contemporary British poets, all off by heart. A prodigious memory. So education is a key aspect of Kennelly's work. And also, I think what Brendan writes brilliantly about is that almost that lost generation in the 40s and 50s, where school was a brutal experience. And one of the more enlightened teachers was, of course, Brian McMahon, who's another writer who features in the Writers Museum. But Brendan's experience of education in the primary school is not the most positive, and this is after school. The teacher sneered. Carmody, I know you're dull, but try to answer. Carmody's wild eyes floundered. Ah, Carmody, you fool, you fool. The anguish in his face speared his heart. After school, the children badgered him beneath a bridge. Open his trousers, quick, pull out his tool. He stood there shivering on the edge of madness. Their taunting fouled his ears, sent horror screaming through his mind. Then amid the soul-insulting jeers, he heard the river at his side, saying he should close his eyes on all his kind. The river cried and cried and cried. And this shows the other side of education for Brendan. You have a beautiful poem like Poem for a 3-year-old. And is there anything more magical than a child's questioning, a child's interest, a child's natural love for learning? And you know, when I see students arriving in Mary Immaculate College in September, I didn't see it this year, hopefully see it next September with a bit of luck. You can kind of see that the school system has almost squeezed the joy out of them, that education has become a chore. And of course, many people's experience of education was unfortunately negative, but naturally people do appear as if they want to learn. And so Brendan has written this wonderful essay on poetry and violence. And I just wanted to read a brief extract from his essay on violence, because Brendan has written continually about violence. Cromwell was a violent individual. Judas Iscariot was the cause of Jesus being crucified, and Judas himself had a violent end. Brendan has an obsession with violence, but it's violence in a whole variety of forms. And that's what he has written about the role of poetry in terms of the description of violence. Poetry, like the moth to the flame, is drawn towards violence. But poetry does not perish because of this attraction. In fact, poetry is animated, vitalized, refreshed by the contact. This is so, I think, because poetry is neither moral nor immoral. It is amoral. It exists beyond conventional morality. If poetry merely reflected conventional morality, it would exist only in Christmas bards and after-dinner speeches. But poetry creates its own fierce, vigorous code of morality. It was Synge who said that before verse can be human again, it must learn to be brutal. This is the real crux. If poetry is to be real, challenging, primitive, and sophisticated at once, that it must observe and imitate that fundamental principle of life in a million different ways under the guise of politeness, concern, do-gooding, converting, enlightening, educating, loving. People do violence to each other. Not to perceive and explore this in poetry is to open the floodgates of sentimentality and sententious moralizing. That is why I personally believe that poetry, far from being consolatory and uplifting, like some Victorian pill to send you to sleep, radiant with beautiful thoughts, poetry is dangerous, particularly if it is constantly and attentively read. Not all of it is like this, but a surprising amount of it is. Isn't that a wonderful piece of writing? It's a beautiful, I think, description of exactly what Brendan's poetry is about. Poetry should be real, challenging, primitive, and sophisticated. And poetry does need to challenge. You know, we sometimes, I think, have the impression that poets shouldn't be writing about political events. They should stick to an aesthetic. But Brendan is a poet who is absolutely written about politics, about history, and about our complex relationship with the past. And so I just have, I'm coming towards my conclusion now, folks, you'd be delighted to hear. But I just wanted to just very briefly talk about some very simple themes that Brendan is concerned with. And of course, one of these is a profound sense of place. And his hometown is very, very important to Brendan. His experience of growing up there, the characters he grew up with, the pub he grew up in, his family, his daughter, his grandchildren, all of these are acutely important to him. And what I find interesting about Brendan is I wrote a book about Paul Durcan in 2016. And Durcan is very explicit and very open about his familial relations. Brendan, I think, has retained an admirable sense of privacy in terms of his family, which is very difficult, I think, for a poet, because poets are public figures and their work is public. But I think Brendan has maintained a tremendous dignity around his family, and clearly family is of a profound sense of importance to him, as is a sense of place. And I really do think Brendan is a master of form, rhythm, and meter. You can hear it when Brendan reads, and unfortunately, folks, you have to listen to me reading. But listen to Brendan. When you hear Brendan reading his own poetry, he has the most beautiful voice. I would swap my voice for Brendan in a heartbeat. And when I was at that reading in Blanchardstown, I was standing behind him looking out. God, I wish at lectures, I wish my students looked back at me the way the people were looking at Brendan. But unfortunately, that's not how they look at me. Brendan was getting worshipping looks from the people because he is a master of the craft. And he has a poem, and I use this quote all the time, and I'm always fascinated when I see someone good at doing something. Brendan has this wonderful poem called "The Singing Girl is Easy in Her Skill." And you know, when you see someone who's good at something, it seems to be so easy, so natural. And Brendan has that, and he is a master of the craft and a master of form. And he is very much a person who explores fragility and vulnerability and is a champion of the broken. And this is what gives Brendan's poetry, I think, a universality. And it's why Brendan's poetry, I think, will be read for many decades to come, because society is full of broken people. And Brendan is their champion. Brendan is a person who has voiced them and poetically, in a sense, stood up for them. But Brendan is also a great follower of the comic muse. And I would say that this is very hard to do. You know, we like humor in Ireland. We appreciate humor. We enjoy it. But it's not easy to write, particularly in poetry. Comedy is very difficult to do. And of course, Brendan is attuned to the influences of history as well, of course. But of course, I'm coming towards the end now, folks, as I keep saying. It's important to remember that Brendan is not just a poet, but Brendan has written 2 novels, The Crooked Cross from 1963, the year I was born. I know you find that hard to believe. And The Florentines from 1969. Now, The Crooked Cross is an interesting novel because it's based on this fictional town of Diva. But it's kind of based, I think, well, Brendan has said it is, on Ballylongford itself, which, if you see it from an aerial picture, is a crooked cross. The cross of Ballylongford village is not exactly a square cross, but it is a crooked cross. And in it, it's something which I think the people of Ballylongford have never experienced before, which is a drought. Can you ever imagine a drought in Ireland? They experience a drought, and the novel is about how the people cope with that particular aspect. But I did want folks to certainly mention Brendan as a teacher. I think this is really important. You know, Brendan is often, he's portrayed obviously as the poet. That's how he's known. But I've met so many people who attended Brendan's lectures and raved about his lectures, what a powerful teacher he was, what an enthusiastic teacher he was. And one of those is Paula Meehan, who in her own right, I would say, is one of Ireland's finest poets, contemporary poets writing today. She's a wonderful poet. I strongly recommend you have a read of some of her work. She's brilliant. But Paula has written about Brendan. He taught me at Trinity, where I was an undergraduate from 72 to 77. What I hold from his lectures, what he communicated, was the suffered human life behind the text. That poetry came from the inarticulate reaches of the wounded heart and had little to do with fluency and certainty. Not that there was anything gloomy about those lectures, and they come back to me now, wreathed in laughter, and as something I looked forward to. And imagine looking forward to going to lectures. Wouldn't that be wonderful? And I can imagine looking forward to going to one of Brendan's lectures. And of course, one of Ireland's leading literary critics, and in fact, one of our great intellects, Declan Kyberd, was also a student of Brendan's. And he said, he remained in my mind always as a model of how the work of a lecturer should be done. Ireland has produced a lot of poets, but no country in any single generation produced more than a handful of inspiring teachers. And since the gift of true teaching is a matter of learning as well as instincts, I feel sure that some unsung man or woman back in Kerry in the 1940s was such an exemplar to him, for there is an apostolic succession in that craft too. And I can guarantee you someone listening tonight will know that person, probably back from the 1940s. I'm going to finish up now, folks. Just to briefly mention this extraordinary moment. I'm sure you're all familiar with it, when Brendan appeared on the Late Late Show. And it was reviewed in the Belfast Telegraph recently. These are some of the highlights of the Late Late Show. Our younger audiences will not know what the Late Late Show was, but for me, and particularly my parents' generation, the Late Late Show was a staple of Irish society. And I could literally do a pub quiz on this, couldn't I? If you can name all the people in those pictures. You have, of course, Annie Murphy, who with the whole Eamon Casey controversy, Pádraig Flynn, God bless P. Flynn, the difficulty of managing 3 houses, wasn't it awful, on his meager salary. Terry Keane, who admitted to a decades-long affair with Charlie Haughey. Gerry Adams, when Gay Byrne refused to shake his hand. Peter Brook, do you remember the Northern Ireland secretary who sang Waltzing Matilda, I think, the night of some massacre in the north of Ireland, and was fired as a result, had to leave his job as a result. And I had this great with the Bishop discussed it with Telefish Air and Show. Gay Byrne was a figure, some people loved him, some people loathed him. But Brendan appeared on the show one night, and the prize was a car towards the end of the program. Brendan, and there's a great quote from Pat Bourne. And one of the greatest descriptions I've ever heard of Brendan is this one. He's like the entire cast of the Canterbury Tales rolled into one. That is such a brilliant description, to be both the thoughtful and erudite professor of modern literature, and at the same time, the untamable, almost feral voice of passion, inspiration, and the flesh, a liberation theologist whose weapons were the word, laughter, and prodigious feats of memory. And I think this is a still from the actual night Brendan was on, but it was recalled in the Daily Telegraph as Gay Byrne's finest hour, when Rita Hanley was the woman's name. She won a car on the show, and Brendan was a guest. And when she won the car, she didn't seem overly excited, and said, when you wonder why she didn't seem delighted with the news, Miss Hanley explained that her daughter Linda had died the previous night, having been knocked down by a car. Byrne, who was always a natural during overwhelming moments of emotion, didn't miss a beat. He spoke gently to her about her grief and offered her comfort and support. Then he turned to a guest, poet Brendan Kennelly, who happened to be on the show, and asked him for a few words. He responded by quietly reciting his fitting poem, Begin, and the whole nation was stunned into silence. Many pinpoint this as Byrne's finest hour. And I'd like to finish tonight, folks, to give Brendan the stage, rightly so. And this is the poem Begin, which in many ways is Brendan's signature poem, and was the poem that he read that evening. Begin again to the summoning birds, to the sight of light at the window. Begin to the roar of morning traffic all along Pembroke Road. Every beginning is a promise, born in light and dying in dark determination and exaltation of springtime, flowering the way to work. Begin to the pageant of queuing girls, the arrogant loneliness of swans in the canal, bridges linking the past and future, old friends passing, though with us still. Begin to the loneliness that cannot end, since it perhaps is what makes us begin. Begin to wonder at unknown faces, at crying birds in the sudden rain, at branches stark in the willing sunlight, at seagulls foraging for bread, at couples sharing a sunny secret, alone together while making good. Though we live in a world that dreams of ending, that always seems about to give in. Something that will not acknowledge conclusion insists that we forever begin. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much, John. That was powerful, fascinating. I enjoyed that so much.
Thank you,
wonder
Cara.
if I go back to the gallery view there, and I'm sure you all join me in thanking John for an excellent talk this evening. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. I'm not sure if anybody has any questions for John. If you'd like to either maybe type a note in the chat. I don't see any questions, or if you want to unmute. And thanks. Yeah, there's a lot of thank you there, John.
Thank you very much. Wonderful.
That Marlene, is it?
Yes, thank you very much. Very enjoyable.
Oh, thank you, Marlene. You're very kind. Thank you.